A routine flight turns into a nightmare. The morning sun glinted off the massive windows of O'Hare International Airport as thousands of travelers rushed through the bustling terminals. Detective James Patterson moved through the crowd with practiced ease, his carry-on bag rolling smoothly behind him. At 42 years old, James had spent nearly 2 decades with the Chicago Police Department, the last 5 as a senior detective in the Major Crimes Division. Today, he was flying to Miami for an urgent meeting with federal investigators about a multi-state trafficking case. James approached Gate 37, where passengers were already lining up to board Flight 892 to Miami. He pulled out his boarding pass and scanned it at the gate. The attendant smiled politely and waved him through. As he stepped onto the jet bridge, James felt a familiar mix of anticipation and fatigue. This case had consumed his life for the past 6 months, but they were finally close to making arrests. An unexpected challenge. The airplane's interior was cool and filled with the usual sounds of passengers settling in. James located his seat in row 12, a window seat he had specifically selected for the 3-hour flight. He needed the time to review case files without interruption. As he approached his row, he noticed a flight attendant standing near the galley, watching passengers board with an unusually intense expression. James lifted his bag into the overhead compartment and settled into his seat. He pulled out his laptop and a thick folder marked "Confidential" in red letters. Just as he was about to open it, a sharp voice cut through the ambient noise. "Excuse me, sir." James looked up to see the flight attendant he had noticed earlier. Her name tag read Rebecca Walsh. She was a woman in her mid-30s with auburn hair pulled back severely and eyes that held an inexplicable hostility. "Yes?" James replied courteously, assuming she needed to check something routine. "I need to see your boarding pass and identification," Rebecca demanded, her tone anything but routine. James felt a flicker of unease but complied, reaching for his wallet. "Of course. Is there a problem?" The situation escalates. Rebecca snatched the documents from his hand with unnecessary force. She examined them with exaggerated scrutiny, turning them over multiple times. James noticed other passengers beginning to watch the interaction with curiosity. "These look suspicious," Rebecca announced loudly enough for nearby passengers to hear. "I'm going to need to verify these credentials." James's professional instincts kicked in. Something was very wrong here. "Ma'am, I can assure you everything is in order. I'm a police detective with the Chicago PD. If there's a genuine concern, perhaps we could discuss this privately." "A detective?" Rebecca's voice dripped with skepticism. "These documents could easily be forged. I've seen cases like this before." An elderly woman across the aisle, Mrs. Dorothy Henderson, spoke up in a wavering but firm voice. "Young lady, this gentleman has done nothing wrong. Why are you harassing him?" Rebecca whirled on her. "Ma'am, please stay out of this. This is a security matter." "Security matter?" A young businessman named Trevor Banks pulled out his phone and started recording. "This looks like harassment to me." The accusation grows. James remained calm despite his growing frustration. Years of dealing with difficult situations had taught him that losing his composure would only make things worse. "Ms. Walsh, I understand you have security concerns, but I've shown you valid identification and my boarding pass. What specifically is the issue?" Rebecca's face flushed red. "The issue is that I have the authority to remove any passenger I deem a security risk, and right now, you're exhibiting suspicious behavior." "Suspicious behavior?" James kept his voice level. "I've been sitting in my assigned seat, preparing to work. How is that suspicious?" Several other passengers began voicing their support for James. A woman in business attire called out, "This is absolutely ridiculous. He hasn't done anything wrong." Rebecca seemed to feed off the attention, her conviction growing stronger. "I'm calling security. Until this is resolved, you need to gather your belongings and exit the aircraft." standing his ground. James felt the weight of every eye in the cabin on him. He had faced dangerous criminals, life-threatening situations, and intense interrogations, but nothing quite like this public humiliation. Still, he refused to be bullied. "I'm not leaving this plane unless you can provide a legitimate reason," James stated firmly. "I have not violated any regulations, and I have every right to be here." "Are you refusing to comply with crew instructions?" Rebecca's voice rose triumphantly, as if she had caught him in a trap. "That's a federal offense." Mrs. Henderson stood up, her hands shaking with indignation. "This is discrimination, plain and simple. Someone call the captain." Trevor continued recording, narrating quietly into his phone. "This is unbelievable. A passenger is being threatened with removal for absolutely no reason. The point of no return." Rebecca stormed toward the front of the plane, her face contorted with anger. "Everyone needs to calm down. I am in charge of safety on this aircraft, and I will not tolerate insubordination." James sat perfectly still, his training screaming at him to de-escalate, but knowing that any movement could be twisted against him. His mind raced through options. He could show his badge, but something told him that might only make things worse with this particular attendant. A flight attendant from the rear galley approached nervously. "Rebecca, maybe we should just verify his documents through the system and move on. The captain needs us to prepare for departure." "No," Rebecca snapped. "This passenger is leaving this plane. Now." The cabin erupted in protests. At least a dozen passengers were now recording the incident on their phones. James could hear snippets of their commentary. "This is going viral. Absolutely shameful. Someone needs to sue." James finally spoke, his voice carrying the authority of his years in law enforcement. "Ms. Walsh, I'm going to give you one opportunity to step back and reconsider this course of action. I have committed no offense. I am sitting peacefully in my assigned seat. If you force me off this plane without cause, there will be serious consequences." Rebecca's eyes blazed with defiance. "Is that a threat?" "It's a fact," James replied calmly. "I'm asking you, as a professional, to think carefully about what you're doing." For a moment, something flickered in Rebecca's expression, perhaps doubt or recognition of how far things had gone. But pride and something darker won out. "Security," she called out loudly. "I need security at gate 37 immediately." The cabin fell into a tense silence, broken only by the electronic beeps and chimes of multiple phones recording what would soon become a national scandal. James sat quietly, his hands visible on his lap, knowing that the next few minutes would change everything. Authority arrives within minutes. Two airport security officers appeared at the aircraft door, their expressions cautious as they took in the scene. Behind them, a tall man in a captain's uniform strode purposefully down the aisle. Captain Richard Anderson had been flying commercial aircraft for 23 years and had seen his share of passenger disputes, but the tension in this cabin was palpable. "What seems to be the problem here?" Captain Anderson's voice carried natural authority that immediately commanded attention. Rebecca rushed forward, her words tumbling out in a rush. "Captain, this passenger has refused to comply with crew instructions. He's being belligerent and threatening. I've asked him multiple times to deplane, and he's refused." Captain Anderson turned to James, his expression neutral but assessing. "Sir, I'm going to need to hear your side of this." James stood slowly, keeping his movements deliberate and non-threatening. "Captain Anderson, my name is Detective James Patterson with the Chicago Police Department. I boarded this flight with valid credentials, sat in my assigned seat, and began preparing work documents. Ms. Walsh approached me, demanded my identification, claimed it looked suspicious despite being legitimate, and has been attempting to remove me from the aircraft without any valid reason." "He's lying," Rebecca interjected. "He was acting suspicious, and when I questioned him, he became hostile." "The truth emerges." Captain Anderson held up his hand for silence. Let me see your identification, please. James reached carefully into his jacket pocket, aware that security officers had their hands near their equipment. He produced his police badge, his driver's license, and his boarding pass. Captain Anderson examined them thoroughly, then pulled out his phone and stepped aside, making a quiet call. Mrs. Henderson spoke up again, her voice stronger now. Captain, I've been sitting right here the entire time. That young man did nothing wrong. He was polite and calm. Your flight attendant has been harassing him from the moment he sat down. I recorded everything, Trevor added, holding up his phone. This entire interaction is documented. He never raised his voice, never threatened anyone. He just asked for a legitimate reason why he was being targeted. A woman in row 10 stood up. I'm an attorney, and what I've witnessed here is textbook discrimination. This man has been professional and courteous throughout this ordeal. Captain Anderson returned, his expression had shifted from neutral to troubled. Detective Patterson, I've just verified your credentials with Chicago PD Dispatch. They confirm your identity and that you're traveling on official business related to a federal investigation. Rebecca's face went pale. But I was just following protocol. He looked suspicious, and I have the right to ensure passenger safety. Suspicious how? Captain Anderson's voice had taken on an edge. What specifically about Detective Patterson's behavior warranted this confrontation? Rebecca floundered, her earlier confidence crumbling. He just seemed out of place in first class, and those documents looked fake, and he was being evasive. The crowd's verdict: I was sitting in economy class, not first class, James corrected quietly. And I answered every question you asked. One of the security officers, Officer Miguel Santos, stepped forward. Ma'am, with all due respect, I've reviewed Detective Patterson's credentials myself. They're completely legitimate. There's no security issue here. The second officer nodded in agreement. Detective Patterson is actually well known in law enforcement circles. He's received multiple commendations for his work. Captain Anderson's jaw tightened. Rebecca, I need you to step into the galley. Now. As Rebecca moved away, her face flushed with embarrassment and anger, Captain Anderson turned to James. Detective Patterson, on behalf of this airline, I apologize profoundly for this incident. This should never have happened. James nodded slowly, but his expression remained serious. Captain, I appreciate the apology, but this goes beyond a simple misunderstanding. Your flight attendant targeted me without cause, made false accusations, and attempted to remove me from this aircraft solely based on her own biases. The media storm begins outside the aircraft. Word of the incident had already begun spreading. Trevor's live stream had been viewed by thousands of people in real time, and other passengers had posted their recordings to social media. News crews, alerted by the viral videos, were rushing to the airport. Inside the plane, Captain Anderson made an announcement over the intercom. Ladies and gentlemen, I apologize for this delay. We're working to resolve an internal matter, and we'll have you on your way shortly. Thank you for your patience. He turned back to James, speaking quietly. Detective, you have every right to file a complaint. In fact, I encourage you to do so. What happened here violated our company's policies and basic human decency. James looked around at the other passengers, many of whom were still recording, still watching. Captain, I've spent 20 years in law enforcement. I've faced down armed criminals, I've worked undercover in dangerous situations, and I've testified in dozens of high-profile cases. But standing here, being accused and humiliated in front of all these people for simply existing in a space where someone decided I didn't belong? That's something different entirely. The truth about Rebecca. Captain Anderson's phone buzzed insistently. He glanced at it and his expression darkened further. I'm being told by our corporate office that this isn't the first complaint against Ms. Walsh. Apparently, there have been 3 previous incidents reported in the past year, all involving passengers of color. A murmur rippled through the cabin. Trevor spoke up from his seat. So this is a pattern? And nothing was done about it? The attorney from row 10 pulled out her business card. Detective Patterson, my name is Jennifer Liu. I specialize in civil rights cases. If you decide to pursue legal action, I'd be honored to represent you pro bono. James took the card, his mind processing everything. Thank you, Ms. Liu. I'll definitely consider that. Captain Anderson received another call, this one clearly from a higher authority. His responses were clipped. Yes, sir. I understand. He's standing right here. I'll tell him. He ended the call and turned to James with a grave expression. Detective, that was our CEO. The videos from this incident have already been viewed millions of times. Major news networks are covering it. Our company is facing what they're calling a public relations catastrophe. He paused, choosing his words carefully. They want to offer you significant compensation and a formal public apology. A moment of decision. James was silent for a long moment, looking around the cabin at all the faces watching him. These strangers had stood up for him, had recorded the truth, had refused to let injustice happen in silence. Captain Anderson, I don't want compensation. I don't want private apologies or quiet settlements. What I want is for this to mean something. How many other people has Ms. Walsh treated this way when there weren't dozens of cameras recording? How many other passengers have been removed from flights, humiliated, or worse, because someone in authority decided they looked suspicious or out of place? Mrs. Henderson started clapping. Within seconds, the entire cabin erupted in applause. James felt emotion welling up in his chest, but he maintained his composure. Captain Anderson nodded with respect. You're right. This needs to be addressed systematically, not just swept under the rug with a payout. Rebecca, who had been listening from the galley, suddenly emerged. Her face was streaked with tears. I'm sorry, she choked out. I don't know what I was thinking. I just assumed, and I was wrong, and I'm so sorry. James looked at her, seeing not just the woman who had humiliated him, but a symbol of something larger and more insidious. Ms. Walsh, your apology is noted. But you need to understand something. You didn't just make a mistake today. You acted on prejudices that are deeply embedded in our society. Those assumptions, those biases, they have real consequences. They ruin lives, they destroy careers, they even get people killed. The decision is made. Captain Anderson stepped in. Ms. Walsh, you're suspended effective immediately pending a full investigation. You need to deplane now. As Rebecca gathered her belongings, escorted by security, the gravity of the situation seemed to fully hit her. She paused near James. I really am sorry. I know that doesn't fix anything, but I am. James met her eyes. Then prove it. Use this as a moment to examine your own biases and work to change. That's the only way this means anything. As Rebecca left the aircraft, Captain Anderson turned to the passengers. Ladies and gentlemen, due to this incident, we'll be experiencing a significant delay while we bring in a replacement crew member. Anyone who wishes to deplane and take a later flight will be fully accommodated with no penalties. Not a single passenger stood up. Mrs. Henderson spoke for everyone, we're staying. We're seeing this through. Captain Anderson smiled for the first time. Thank you. Detective Patterson, your ticket will be upgraded to first class, and I'd like to personally ensure you make it to Miami safely. James finally sat back down, exhausted. His phone was buzzing constantly with calls from his precinct, from friends, from reporters who had somehow gotten his number. He looked out the window at the airport, where he could now see news vans gathering. This is going to be bigger than I thought, he muttered to himself. Trevor leaned across the aisle. Detective, you handled that with incredible grace. A lot of people would have lost their temper. That's exactly what they expect, James replied quietly. The moment I had raised my voice or shown anger, I would have become the threat they were trying to paint me as. That's the trap. You have to be twice as calm, twice as professional, twice as perfect, just to be treated as equal. The weight of that truth settled over the cabin as they prepared for departure, the media firestorm. By the time Flight 892 finally took off, 47 minutes behind schedule, the incident had become the top trending topic on every major social media platform. The hashtag Justice for Detective Patterson was being used millions of times per hour. News helicopters circled both O'Hare and Miami International, waiting for the flight's arrival. James spent the flight trying to focus on his case files, but it was impossible to concentrate. Captain Anderson had visited him twice to apologize again and ensure he had everything he needed. Flight attendants who had replaced Rebecca went out of their way to be accommodating, though James suspected their kindness was tinged with corporate fear rather than genuine care. When the plane touched down in Miami, Captain Anderson made an announcement. "Detective Patterson, I've been informed that there's significant media presence at the gate. Airport security has offered to escort you through a private exit if you prefer." James considered this for a moment, then spoke loudly enough for the cabin to hear. "Thank you, Captain, but I'll walk through the regular terminal. I haven't done anything wrong, and I won't hide like I have." The passengers applauded again. As the plane taxied to the gate, James gathered his belongings. Mrs. Henderson reached out and squeezed his hand. "You're a good man. Don't let them wear you down." "Thank you, ma'am. Your support today meant more than you know." Facing the cameras. The jetway opened, and James stepped out into chaos. Dozens of reporters shouted questions simultaneously, camera flashes exploding like lightning. Airport security struggled to maintain order. James stopped, took a breath, and raised his hand. The crowd quieted somewhat. "I'll make a brief statement," James announced. "Then I have federal business to attend to." The cameras focused on him with laser intensity. James looked directly into the lenses, knowing millions would see this. "Today, I was subjected to discrimination while trying to board a flight. A flight attendant targeted me without cause, made assumptions based on my appearance, and attempted to remove me from the aircraft despite having committed no violation. This happened not because of anything I did, but because of who I am." He paused, letting that sink in. "I'm a detective with 20 years of service. I have a badge, credentials, and a reputation. But none of that mattered in that moment. And here's what troubles me most: I'm one of the lucky ones. I had the training to stay calm, the authority to demand respect, and dozens of witnesses who stood up for me. But how many people face this same discrimination without those advantages? How many people are removed from flights, denied service, humiliated in public, and have no recourse?" A call for change. James's voice grew stronger, more passionate. "This isn't about one flight attendant or one airline. This is about systemic prejudice that permeates our society. It's about assumptions made in split seconds that have lasting consequences. It's about the exhausting burden of having to prove your humanity, your worth, your right to exist in spaces where others take their presence for granted." A reporter shouted, "Detective, will you be filing a lawsuit?" "I'm considering all legal options," James replied. "But more importantly, I'm calling for concrete action. Airlines need mandatory, comprehensive anti-discrimination training. There need to be real consequences for staff who engage in racial profiling. There need to be independent oversight mechanisms to investigate complaints. And there needs to be transparency when these incidents occur, not quiet settlements that protect corporate images while allowing the problem to persist." Another reporter called out, "What do you say to people who think you're overreacting?" James's expression hardened. "I'd say they've never had to live with the constant vigilance of wondering if today is the day someone decides you're suspicious for existing. They've never had to coach their children on how to behave around authority figures to minimize the risk of violence or discrimination. They've never felt the knot in their stomach when they enter a space and see people's expressions change. Until you've lived that reality, you don't get to decide if the reaction is proportional. The airline responds. While James spoke to the media, executives at the airline's headquarters were in crisis mode. The CEO, Thomas Bradford, called an emergency board meeting. The company's stock had already dropped 3% in after-hours trading. Customer service lines were flooded with angry callers demanding answers. Bradford stood before the board, his face grim. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're facing the worst public relations crisis in our company's history. The videos have been viewed over 50 million times globally. Civil rights organizations are calling for boycotts. Our brand reputation has taken a catastrophic hit." A board member asked, "What's our liability exposure?" "Significant," the company's legal counsel responded. "But frankly, the financial damage from this incident will extend far beyond any lawsuit. We're looking at potential Department of Transportation investigations, congressional hearings, and long-term brand damage that could cost hundreds of millions." Bradford nodded. "Which is why we need to take unprecedented action. Not just for optics, but because this revealed serious failures in our systems and culture." Sweeping reforms announced. Within hours, the airline issued a comprehensive statement. They announced Rebecca Walsh's termination, a complete overhaul of their training programs, the creation of an independent civil rights oversight board, mandatory quarterly anti-discrimination training for all staff, and a commitment to transparency in handling future complaints. But the most surprising announcement came at the end. The airline would fund a national scholarship program for students pursuing careers in criminal justice and civil rights, named in honor of Detective James Patterson, whether he approved or not. When James heard about this, he was skeptical. "It sounds good," he told Jennifer Liu, the attorney who had offered to represent him, "but I've seen too many corporate diversity initiatives that are all talk and no substance." "Then let's make sure this one has teeth," Jennifer replied. "We'll push for enforceable metrics, regular audits, and real accountability. If they're serious about change, they'll agree to oversight." The congressional response. The incident caught the attention of lawmakers in Washington. Senator Patricia Reynolds, chair of the Commerce Committee, announced hearings on discrimination in commercial aviation. "What happened to Detective Patterson is unacceptable," she declared on the Senate floor. "But it's not an isolated incident. We've heard from hundreds of travelers who've experienced similar treatment. It's time for federal action." Representative David Chen introduced legislation requiring airlines to report discrimination complaints publicly and face penalties for patterns of discriminatory behavior. "Transparency and accountability are essential," he told reporters. "Airlines can't be allowed to handle these incidents behind closed doors anymore." James watched these developments from his hotel room in Miami, feeling both vindicated and overwhelmed. His phone hadn't stopped ringing. His precinct captain called to offer support. The mayor of Chicago wanted to honor him with a commendation. Civil rights organizations wanted him to speak at their events. But the call that meant the most came from his daughter, Nicole, a college sophomore. "Dad, I saw what happened. I'm so sorry you had to go through that, but I'm so proud of how you handled it. You showed me what real strength looks like." James felt tears welling up. "Baby girl, I just did what I thought was right." "That's exactly my point," Nicole replied. "You always do. And now the whole world sees what I've always known, that my dad is a hero." Personal reflection. Late that night, after the media frenzy had died down slightly, James sat alone on his hotel balcony overlooking the Miami skyline. He thought about his father, who had been a factory worker in Detroit and had faced far worse discrimination than James had experienced today. His father had taught him to stand up for himself, but also to channel anger into action. He thought about all the times throughout his career when he'd faced subtle and not so subtle racism. The suspects who refused to believe he was a detective. The colleagues who assumed he was less capable. The everyday indignities that accumulated over a lifetime. But he also thought about the passengers on that plane who had stood up for him. Mrs. Henderson, Trevor, Jennifer, Captain Anderson, and dozens of others who had refused to be silent witnesses to injustice. That gave him hope. Moving forward. The next morning, James held a formal press conference. The room was packed with journalists from around the world. He read from a prepared statement but spoke from the heart. "I want to thank everyone who has reached out with support. Your messages, your solidarity, and your willingness to speak truth to power have been overwhelming. But I also want to be clear about something. I'm not special. I'm not unique. What happened to me happens to people of color every single day in this country, in ways large and small." He looked directly at the cameras. "The question isn't whether I'll be okay. I will be. I have resources, support, and privilege within the system. The question is what happens next for everyone else. Will this be a turning point, or will it be another viral moment that fades away while the underlying problems persist? I'm committing myself to be part of the solution. I'll work with lawmakers, with airlines, with civil rights organizations, with anyone serious about creating real change. But I can't do it alone. This requires all of us to examine our own biases, to speak up when we see injustice, and to demand better from the institutions we support." Rebecca's journey. In a small apartment across town, Rebecca Walsh watched James's press conference through tears. She had been fired, publicly vilified, and was facing possible legal action. Her life had been turned upside down in a matter of hours. But as she listened to James speak about systemic change and examining biases, something shifted in her. She picked up her phone and called a therapist who specialized in unconscious bias and prejudice. "I need help," she said simply. "I need to understand why I did what I did, and I need to change." It wouldn't undo the harm she had caused. It wouldn't erase the pain she had inflicted on James and countless others. But it was a start. And perhaps, in some small way, it represented the kind of personal reckoning that needed to happen on a much larger scale. The verdict of history. 6 months later, James testified before Congress about his experience and recommendations for reform. The resulting legislation, known as the Equal Skies Act, mandated comprehensive anti-discrimination measures for all commercial airlines and created federal oversight mechanisms. The airline that had employed Rebecca implemented the most extensive anti-bias training program in the industry and became, ironically, a model for others to follow. The scholarship program in James's name had awarded its first grants to promising students from underrepresented communities. Rebecca, after months of therapy and education, began speaking publicly about her experience, not to excuse her actions but to illustrate how ordinary people can harbor and act on prejudices they don't even consciously recognize. James returned to his work with the Chicago PD, but he also became a sought-after speaker and consultant on issues of discrimination and bias in law enforcement and other industries. He used his platform not to elevate himself but to amplify the voices of those who didn't have his advantages. The final word. A year after the incident, James was invited to speak at a criminal justice conference. In his closing remarks, he reflected on everything that had happened. "That day on the plane changed my life," he said. "But it also revealed something important about our society. When injustice happens in public, when people bear witness and refuse to be silent, change becomes possible. Not easy, not automatic, but possible. We're all works in progress. We all carry biases we need to examine. We all have moments where we fail to live up to our ideals. The question is whether we're willing to do the hard work of growth and change, both individually and collectively. I'm hopeful because I've seen what's possible when people choose courage over comfort, when they choose solidarity over silence. That plane full of strangers who stood up for me, they reminded me that most people, when faced with clear injustice, want to do the right thing. Our job is to create systems and cultures that make it easier for them to do so." He concluded with the words that had become his mantra: "Justice isn't a destination. It's a direction. And every day, we choose which way we're moving." The audience rose in a standing ovation, but James knew the real work was just beginning. The incident on Flight 892 had sparked a national conversation, but conversations alone don't create change. Action does. Commitment does. Persistence does. And as he looked out at the crowd, filled with law enforcement officers, civil rights advocates, airline executives, and ordinary citizens who wanted to make a difference, James felt something he hadn't felt in a long time: genuine hope for the future. The truth that shocked everyone wasn't just that he was a respected detective. It was that he represented countless others who deserved dignity and respect regardless of their profession or credentials. The shock was in holding up a mirror to society and forcing people to see what they had been willing to overlook. And that truth, uncomfortable as it was, became the foundation for something better.